The following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation.
There is a divide in British Columbia. Most people who live in the north would tell you there's always been a divide in British Columbia, that it's not anything new. But now the electoral map is showing that, I think, in a clearer way than we've seen before.
Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, and the fallout continues from a unique election in British Columbia, one that the situation we are still waiting to clarify, but some things are clear. Right off the top there, you saw our guest from last week, Carol James, talking about the emphasis on a divide in British Columbia, made more obvious than ever by this year's election results. To talk about it in general terms and economic terms, delighted to have back on the show Ben Parfitt. Thanks for being here, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Vaughn.
And good to have you back, Jock Finlayson, as well.
Glad to be here.
And start me off talking about just the uncertainty of going this many weeks without a government in British Columbia.
Well, it's pretty unprecedented, and I recall in 2008-9, after the Great Crisis, economists started to write about uncertainty as something that was affecting economic performance and consumer confidence and business confidence in the American context. And that literature has really burgeoned since then. So I'm been spending a bit of time looking at it over the past couple of weeks, because I think we're going into a period, not only right now where we're not exactly clear who's going to be the government, but also what that government is going to be able to accomplish in the Legislative Assembly, given essentially an even split of the parties. So it's a very different environment, including for investors and for the business community.
Ben, your take off the top?
Well, clearly uncertain times ahead. I mean, we haven't seen anything like this in the province for 60 years. A very interesting outcome with pretty much a dead heat between the two main parties and a very significant rise in support for the Greens. So it's going to be very interesting to see how things unfold in the next coming months.
What was just in general, what's the big challenge facing British Columbia when they finally get it sorted out and the new government is in place?
Well, I think we're actually in a fortunate position to some extent. My colleague and I are just writing an op-ed on this right now. And this economy has really surprised to the upside. I mean, BC's been growing way above potential for the past 3 years. We've got the lowest unemployment rate in the country. And the government's budgetary position in terms of the operating budget is quite a bit stronger than people were thinking even 6 or 12 months ago. So from that point of view, whoever does assume the reins of power will be taking over a province where the economy is not doing badly at all, and where the government's own fiscal position is far stronger than we see in a lot of other jurisdictions. So from that perspective, I don't see kind of a crisis, a policy crisis, but what a new government can accomplish given the makeup of the legislature, I think that's a real puzzle.
There's a lot of ambitious statements of purpose in the agreement between the Greens and the NDP, but the New Democrats were pretty careful in their election platform not to promise too much. And they've made it clear already, and Carol James, who was on the show last week, made it clear that they're in command of the budget. So they have some room, from what Jock said, to fund some of their promises, but that my sense is they didn't overpromise, at least not for the first few months.
Well, I don't think that they did. But to pick up on a point that Jock made that I think will be very interesting to follow in the coming months, and that really speaks to the rural-urban divide, is that while we have seen overall economic performance in a positive light in the province, there has been quite an inequitable distribution of those benefits. We have seen, for example, job gains in the Greater Vancouver and Greater Victoria areas, but job loss pretty much everywhere else in the province. And I really think that, it's going to be very interesting to see how the government responds to that reality. There are two very different realities playing out in the province that I think we need to be aware of. And even where there has been some economic gains in the more urban areas, a lot of that gain has come with service sector jobs. So there's much more work that I think needs to be done, and a lot of thinking that I think we need to be looking at in the coming months and years in terms of where our economy sits and in terms of how we address disparities in the system right now.
One of the ironies of the BC election, rising out of what Ben said, is that the Liberals did well in some of the parts of the province where the economy is doing the most struggling, and did more poorly in the metro areas where many of the numbers are positive. So there's more to all this than just the economy, but I think that's one of the things we'll be talking about tonight, some of the issues that impact on that. And I thought I'd go to some of the questions we have on tape on this one, where our regular contributors and some of our not so regular contributors had some things they wanted to say. Let's start off with the head of the BC Federation of Labour, Irene Lansinger. Here she is.
One of the issues that feeds into the debate around the urban-rural divide are environmental issues. And in resource communities across the province, good jobs have been provided by those resources. How do we talk about transition for families in communities outside the Lower Mainland, and talk about how we're going to have good jobs and clean up the environment at the same time?
Start us off on this one, Ben.
Well, I think that there's a couple of important things that we need to be thinking about. One is that you don't have good, firm, secure jobs in rural industries, like the mining industry, for example, if you don't have, at the end of the day, good, robust regulation. So as an example, the disaster that unfolded at Mount Poly wiped out a lot of jobs. And if we go back and we look at the regulation of that industry, it was not properly regulated, and it was that lack of regulation that created the problem that resulted in that disaster. So I think that there's a pretty compelling argument to be made for increasing regulations on resource industries to ensure that they operate in a proper manner, and going along with that actually is job stability. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is that I think that the time has come in this province, and we're seeing it with the softwood lumber dispute, where questions are being raised yet again about the revenues that are generated in the resource sector, and whether the revenues, in particular stumpage rates or royalty rates, are sufficient. Again, I think that we need to be looking more at trying to assess whether those rates are right. Looking perhaps at increasing them, and then looking at taking those increased revenues and reinvesting them back in the communities and the regions from which that economic activity is generating those revenues. And I think if we start to look at reinvestments, better regulation of these sectors, we're going to see improved prospects for jobs.
John?
Yeah, I don't think there's really at a macro level a big conflict between jobs and the environment. I mean, we've got pretty strong environmental standards in the province, maybe not as strong as Ben would like, but compared to a lot of other jurisdictions, I think we look pretty good. And we've seen employment grow, significantly, 3% last year, and the proportion of the population working has gone up. So I don't see, kind of in a macro labor market sense, that there's a huge tension. In the resource industries, at the margin, yeah, you can render your existing industries uncompetitive if you have policies that aren't sort of sensitive to the competitive environment that they're operating in. But the cyclicality of resource markets is really the key factor that I think affects employments. Yes, regions outside the Lower Mainland are not doing as well as urban BC in the past few years, and that is definitely linked into what's been happening in commodity markets. So, those communities are resilient. The people in those industries have gone through cycles before. It would be nice if we had less cyclical volatility, but that's not something we control. And so you just sort of have to soldier on and recognize that these industries are inherently cyclical.
So you look at the price for natural gas at the border at Sumas, or what copper or aluminum are trading for, and
U.S.
and
housing
lumber
starts,
prices, yeah.
currencies, the strength of external demand. All these things are vastly more powerful in shaping the business environment for commodity markets than whatever the government here in Victoria is able to do, in my view.
Yeah. The New Democrats who are coming in, when we asked them about Carol James last week, about one of the economic areas that they'd like to concentrate on that they think hasn't gotten the attention it should have in the last few years, here's what Carol James said.
forestry and revitalizing the forest industry was a huge part of our platform. We've talked about, in fact, looking at a capital plan, whether it's portables in Surrey or whether it's hospitals or whether it's other buildings, actually looking at priority for manufactured wood and the manufactured wood industry here in British Columbia, which would give a chance for those raw logs to actually stay in BC, to be utilized as a product, and to be able to expand the forest industry and keep those resources and those jobs right here in British Columbia. So I think there's some very exciting opportunities, and it will be critical to make sure that we're staying connected with those regions where we don't have MLAs.
One of the biggest changes in the time I've been doing this job, Carol James referred to the fact that the New Democrats didn't win very many seats in the North and the Interior, where they used to have regular members always, especially when they were in government. But the other one is just the degree to which forestry is no longer the center of the BC economy the way it used to be, although I realize it still employs a lot of people and supports a lot of communities.
Yeah, I mean, it's shrunk for sure in terms of its relative footprint. Other industries have grown. We've become more service-oriented. But if you look at the export economy, and we spend a fair amount of time at the Business Council looking at this, because if you're a small market like BC, the acid test of your kind of economic success is whether you can export goods and services to customers elsewhere. Forestry still plays a much bigger role than a lot of people realize, as do resource industries more generally. So almost 80% of our merchandise exports in BC are coming out of resource-based industries. And forestry itself last year, I think, was 35 or 36% of export revenues earned by the province. So it's still pretty big. It doesn't employ as many people as it used to. It's become much more capital intensive. But it still punches above its weight, and I'm not familiar with all the NDP's thinking on revitalizing the industry, but in broad terms, we'd be supportive of looking at how that could be achieved. But it's already a pretty vibrant, competitive sector, albeit facing challenges.
Ben?
Well, definitely, if you look at the forest sector and its importance outside of the major urban centers, it is huge. I did a speaking tour in 5 central BC communities a few months ago. So I was in Mackenzie, Prince George, Fort St. James, Quesnel, and Williams Lake. And in every one of those communities, there's a strong realization that the sector is very, very important, particularly in smaller communities like Fort St. James and Mackenzie. So I think that we have to be cognizant of the fact that this is a very important industry, particularly in smaller rural communities. But I think also we have to think about what Carol James was talking about at one point, which is log exports and the role that plays in potentially foregone job opportunities. And if we look at the last 4 years in the province alone, 26 million cubic meters of raw logs left the province. That's a huge amount of wood that was never processed here in the province. And I think that one of the things that we ought to be thinking about is how we stimulate more investment in the industry to ensure that we have more processing occurring domestically. And then I think the other thing that we can look at doing and should be looking at doing is addressing a very critical problem that we see in the forest sector in this province, particularly in the interior of the province, where there is diminished wood supply and where we're in effect seeing exports within regions of the province, which is a touchstone for a lot of concern in rural communities, where they are seeing massive numbers of logs moving out of their region to feed more fiber-starved regions elsewhere in the province. To give us an example, I was in Fort St. John recently. There were logs being sent by rail 550 kilometers from Fort St. John to Quesnel. And that's because mills in the Quesnel area are running low on wood.
Because of the beetle kill?
Because of the beetle kill, and because of a lot of harvesting activity that took place in response to that. So it'll be very interesting for me to see how the government starts to respond to these issues. What policies does it plan to put in place as far as coastal log exports are concerned, and what is it going to do to grasp the nettle in the interior of the province where there are significant fiber issues?
So I asked Carol James this question last week, which is about the impact of log export restrictions, which tend to be a red flag to the Americans in softwood talks, and in the past have been the basis for punitive duties. So we're going to go to a question from Bill Tillman about softwood, and then I'd like to hear that as well. So here's Bill.
One thing that could unite rural and urban communities is our fight with the United States, and in particular President Donald Trump, over the softwood lumber agreement and other trade negotiations. Do you see some way in which both city folks and country folks can come together around the softwood lumber agreement and other trade issues in common cause?
Do we run a risk on the log export issue of providing the Americans with yet another grounds to slap tariffs on our lumber?
Well, if you look at the dispute the last time around, one of the products that was essentially exempt was raw logs. And there is a lot of pressure from the United States to essentially open up that market.
Yeah.
And I think we need to resist that. I think we need to do everything we can to resist that. I think where we can see some unification of the rural and urban communities in this province around the softwood lumber dispute is really about the idea of taking the raw material from the forests that we have, processing it here in British Columbia, and utilizing the wood products that we have to build, for example, affordable housing in the Vancouver area. So my colleague at the CCPA, Mark Lee, has talked about the need for somewhere in the range of 5,000 to 10,000 new affordable housing units in the Lower Mainland. Pressing need for more housing. If we can start to build linkages and the idea that we should be doing everything we can in this province to utilize and use more wood in the construction of those buildings, then I think, yes, the softwood lumber agreement can act as a backdrop to a more unified thinking between rural and urban residents in the province.
I recognize the Americans will use anything we do, but do we run a particular risk on that one?
Yeah, I mean, Bill's question, I find it hard to imagine that the softwood dispute is going to sort of unite British Columbians in the way that he's perhaps musing about. I mean, this is a nasty, thorny, long-running dispute. It has nothing to do with Donald Trump. The origins of it go back decades. It's like a never-ending trip to the dentist. I mean, I've gone through 5 or 6 of these, and it's the same issues, the same arguments, the same dynamic every single time. If Hillary Clinton was president, I predict we'd be going through precisely the same thing we're facing now. There are Canadian tensions within the Federation between the different lumber-producing provinces. There are issues, within BC. And, incidentally, I'm not opposed to stimulating local demand for wood. That's fine. But let's realize this is an export industry. Canada produces and exports half of all the lumber out of Canada. Of BC produces half all the lumber in the country. And domestic demand here within a province is never going to be more than a sliver of the total kind of consumption of wood. So we need access to markets. We need to figure out what the terms of a new managed trade agreement will be with the United States, because that's what we're going to end up with. And we do need to be careful that we don't make policy decisions that actually weaken our legal and negotiating position with our American counterparts.
We're going to take a brief break. Come back, I want to talk a little bit more about what you both said about the continuing importance of the forest industry to the whole provincial economy. On that note, we will take a brief break on Voice of BC. Stay with us. We will be right back.
The BC interior has had a real up and down economic experience in the last 30 years, with a lot of downtimes, people seeing industries die, new industries come along, and they're very sensitive to jobs and economic growth. The Lower Mainland and South Island have not seen that up and down economy. They've basically seen steady growth over 30 years. People are living in houses worth millions of dollars, unrelated to any economic activity in the province, and they don't necessarily see the direct connection between resource economy and their own personal well-being. I think this is one of the big reasons for the divide we saw, not just in the last election, but a growing divide in the last 3 or 4 elections.
Are you worried about getting diabetes?
I'm an athlete.
Great, but do you know that 1 in 3 Canadians has diabetes or pre-diabetes?
Really?
The Canadian Diabetes Association, with support from Sun Life Financial, urges all Canadians to take the test.
There are more ways to connect with us at Voice of BC.
Email us at vobc@shaw.ca. Follow us on Twitter at Voice of BC. Or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/VOBC on Shaw TV.
It's highly problematic that at a time where urban and rural voters and residents are divided in British Columbia, we face our biggest trade challenge in decades with the United States. The softwood lumber agreement has expired, NAFTA is under question, and we've got to really all be pulling in the same direction at the same time. Instead, we've got big splits. We have to get over that and look at the bigger picture. How do we get a deal with the United States?
Welcome back to Voice of BC. When we went away, we were talking just a little bit about the importance, the continuing importance of the forest industry to British Columbia, and I'd be interested in hearing the response of Ben and Jock, a local government leader at a speech that I was giving a while ago. Got up and said that, they're tired of hearing about the resource communities as the wealth-creating part of the province. We create wealth in the cities too. And I wouldn't argue the point, but it strikes me that in addition to what you've both said about the continuing importance of forestry in particular, but resource export industries in general, that those industries underpin a fair amount of employment in the ports of the province, in transportation, in cities, service industries, even legal and accounting firms, right? It isn't, the jobs aren't just in Fort St. James and Quesnel.
Yeah, there's direct employment, which is what we can, measure easily, and then economic models try and estimate the so-called indirect and induced employment that's associated with resource extraction and processing, particularly given that most of what we produce here is exported, which gives it an added kind of multiplier. So it is important. It's not everything. I mean, there are other industries, and there is a whole urban economy, I think, in British Columbia that frankly isn't completely dependent at all on our resource base. But resources are, they do remain foundational, not just for BC, for Canada. They're half of Canada's exports. Energy is a quarter of Canada's exports, or it was prior to the oil price collapse. So the narrative around resources and some of the tensions we see are not a made in BC phenomenon. I think we're seeing this play out all across the country in a jurisdiction where the population and the voters is more and more urban every day. Metro Vancouver, Greater Montreal, Greater Toronto, 35% of the entire Canadian population. By 2025, it'll be 40%, just living in those three metro areas. It's changing the political dynamics. It, I think, really poses challenges for elected officials and policymakers, because you're talking to an increasingly urban population about industries that they don't feel and see and touch in their own lives, and maybe they feel, and I encounter this every day in my work, people saying, well, we don't, resources aren't that important. We've got clean tech and high tech and film and tourism. And, that really, I think, betrays, Andrew Weaver is actually an example, in my view, of somebody who more or less kind of seems to subscribe to that view. And I think it really is a mischaracterization of how we butter our bread here in BC.
But maybe people don't see it, so they aren't aware of the connection.
I don't think they are as aware of the connection as they used to be. I mean, I remember when I started working at the Vancouver Sun in 1986, I have vivid memories of crossing the Fraser River and seeing, example after example after example of resource industry presence right in the heart of the big city, and much of that has disappeared.
Yeah,
but I think the important thing to remember, and what people fail to understand, is that all of the resources that they take for granted come from somewhere. That the energy that provides the lights that go on in their homes and in their offices comes from the Peace River region. The wood that makes their decks, that frames their houses, comes from somewhere. And I do think it's a kind of disturbing commentary that we have lost touch with the source of many of the resources that we use, and we should be much more appreciative of that. And I think if we were, then issues like the softwood lumber disagreement or what have you would be more important than they are.
The new government has not taken over yet, and they're already engaged in debate on a couple of major issues. Not surprising. Events don't stop just because we're waiting for a legislature session and a swearing in. But a couple of those issues we're going to have questions on next, and they both involve BC Hydro, the largest Crown corporation and one of the largest corporations of any kind in British Columbia. So let's go to Richard McCandless first of all. Here he is.
Ben and Jock, in recent years, the Liberal government has been suppressing the true cost of electricity, but this maneuver has resulted in an increase in Hydro's debt. This is not sustainable in the long run. The NDP have promised to review Hydro's finances. What do you think the NDP should do, knowing that a major increase in rates is going to hurt resource-based communities that depend on mines and wood processing industries?
Who wants to go first? Ben?
Well, I think we clearly do need a review, and I think we need people to understand the disproportionate price that certain industries and certain power users in this province face and deal with. So, as an example, in rural communities where there's a pulp industry presence, which is a number of communities, there are significant challenges that are facing the sector in terms of power costs. And I do think that it's incumbent upon the government to have a very good look at that and to come up with a strategy for dealing with it, because those power costs are stratospheric. For example, if you're a mechanical pulp mill, your power costs outstrip the cost of your labor force. It's a significant cost. And if we look ahead, the other implications that I think we face from new power potentially coming on stream at a much higher cost is that it is again going to carry a disproportionate cost for major industrial users. It's also going to have significant costs for the poorer among us. So I think a review is essential to get at what is a growing problem and challenge across the province, which is sharply rising energy costs.
Yet the outgoing government says repeatedly that we have some of the lowest power rates in North America.
Historically, we've had very cheap power in BC.
That one of our advantages in attracting
investment. It has been, and our industrial structure reflects that to some extent. The kinds of industries that have grown and invested here in decades past, not anymore. I think we're influenced by the availability and reliability and low cost of power. That advantage is diminishing for sure. We're seeing power costs decline in a lot of jurisdictions in North America. They've been rising here. BC Hydro's balance sheet is problematic. The debt has gone from $8 billion, sort of 2008, it'll be $20 billion by the end of the decade due to a tremendous amount of capital spending. There's been a tremendous increase in the deferral accounts, which raises all kinds of accounting issues. Credit rating agencies have taken a skeptical look at it. So I think it is a problem, no matter who is in government, and I'm definitely concerned that we're going to see sustained upward pressure on the cost of power. We would like to see a revitalization of the Utilities Commission, whose role has really been truncated under the Campbell government, and that's continued with Premier Clark. We'd like to see it really placed at the center of decision making on major energy procurement decisions and capital projects, as opposed to having the politicians decide these things. Throughout my career, when I hear politicians articulate grand visions, I grab my wallet and run for the nearest exit, and because very, very frequently it doesn't work out well from a ratepayer or taxpayer view. A Utilities Commission that is well-resourced and has a real mandate to look at the business and economic case for different proposals can really help to strengthen, I think, the environment around electricity in BC. So we will be strongly recommending that, regardless of who forms government.
Well, one of the first issues that the New Democrats say they're going to send to the Utilities Commission within, I guess, days of taking office, since they want answers within 6 weeks, is the subject of the next question. Here's Jordan Bateman.
The 4 ridings closest to the Site C Dam all voted overwhelmingly for the BC Liberals. What right does Andrew Weaver and John Horgan have, living 1,300 kilometers away from that dam, to put 2,100 people out of work on Site C?
Well, first of all, they haven't said they will, but whatever you say about the Utilities Commission needing to be revitalized, is it late in the day to be sending Site C to it for review, in your view?
Well, late might be a polite way of putting it. I mean, I would much rather have seen Site C go through a Utilities Commission review. A political decision was made not to do that, not something that we advocated. Now they've spent $1.7 to $2 billion already on a $9 billion project, and there are contracts that have been signed and so on. So I don't know the inside details. It strikes me as rather improbable that a future government or the next government would decide to kill that project, given how far advanced we are. There are issues about whether the power demand is going to be there in 2024. I think in the long run, in some ways it is a good project. It's base load power, it's renewable, it's carbon free. But we don't want to produce it if we're going to have to sell it at a loss. So these are the things, the business and economic case for it, which was never reviewed by the Utilities Commission, is something that I think would be useful to take a look at, but it'll have to be on a hugely expedited basis, because major reviews like this will typically last 8, 10, 12 months. I mean, that would be a colossal mistake in the case of a project that's already literally advancing as we speak. So a quick review, perhaps, and it would be interesting to see what findings they come up with.
One possibility, of course, would be to say we should have reviewed it some time ago. It's too far along to stop at this point, so they're going to suck it up and let it finish.
Yeah. Well, first, I think we have to place what's happening with the Site C project in a broader context, which kind of gets to what Jock was talking about earlier around the Utilities Commission. This is not the only project that has been exempt from review. There have been major transmission line projects associated with what is going on up there that have been exempt from review as well. And I think we all hydro payers need to be concerned about that, and I think for that reason, I think a review is warranted. I think the other point to make in response to Mr. Bateman's comment is that yes, we can't deny what the electoral results were, but this was not, people in the North were not asked to vote on whether or not they thought the Site C project was a project that they wanted to support. And very, very clearly, there are significant numbers of people up there, including people that ran as independent candidates, that were actively opposed to the project. So it's not clear in my mind at all that the result of those elections was in any kind of way a statement on local support for Site C. I think the other thing that's really important for people to understand too is that the investments that are being made in Site C have to be placed in a broader context as well. BC Hydro is in the midst of upgrades at dams all over the province, and those upgrades are extremely expensive. So if you look at Campbell River, where $1 billion upgrade is underway to basically make a dam that would provide about 1/10 of the power of Site C safe again, those costs are all going to be coming onto the books, and we're all going to be paying for them. So I think that a review should have happened a long time ago, as was recommended by the panel that reviewed Site C, and now somewhat late in the game, it looks like we're going to get that review. One
just caveat I would add is because this project is well advanced, policymakers have got to be a bit sensitive to how it would look to the outside world if we are sort of canceling or stopping a project sanctioned by the government, rather in the collective sense, when it's a quarter or a third built. I mean, the sort of reputational issues. So that's something that I think does need to be factored into the equation for whatever decision is made.
I would add, just a historical note, that the Utilities Commission of British Columbia was created in large measure to conduct a review of Site C way back in 1981, and they did review it. Took them 2.5 years, and they said, don't do it. So whether you can do the same sort of work in 6 weeks, we'll see. I think all three of us agree it should have gone there in the first place. We may disagree on whether or not it is so late in the day that you can't turn back. We should have an answer on that by the fall. The new government is saying 6 weeks for a preliminary answer, 3 months for a final answer. So around about Canadian Thanksgiving or Remembrance Day, we should have a decision from the new government on whether or not to stick with it or stop it. Another good question. This was in the agreement. This is a question about something that was in the agreement between the Greens and the NDP. It's right there. I think it's on the first page of the agreement, actually, which runs about 10 pages. And here with a question about the implications of it, Troy Sebastian.
Often the First Nations veto is raised as a specter over the BC economy. The fear is that if First Nations have the authority to stop projects, that the economy of British Columbia will ground to a halt. I believe that the First Nations veto is actually a good thing for the British Columbia economy, and that having First Nations work with businesses and consent to development on the land base is the only way to move forward in British Columbia. What do you believe?
So the reference there is to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which both the Greens and the NDP support, and which they intend to incorporate into the mandate letters for the cabinet ministers and the new government. It does include in it a commitment that some people have interpreted as a veto. It certainly involves consent by First Nations. So that's where Troy is coming from. What do you think?
Well, directionally, I think we do recognize and agree that First Nations have a vital role to play in all land-based economic development on Crown land, and certainly any company that we work with that is looking at projects in BC has that, very much as a front and center imperative. Whether every single First Nation that's touched by a proposed project has a veto, I think is a somewhat different question. In Canadian sort of constitutional jurisprudence up until now, that has not been the case. I suppose it could change over time. I find it, although we're very supportive of bringing First Nations into the picture in a much more significant way than we've done historically, if every single First Nation with an interest in a project has a veto, you don't need to have a vivid imagination to sketch out a scenario where not much activity takes place. So I think it'd be quite challenging. Having said that, we're pretty good in BC at finding ways to work with First Nations to make them a bigger part of the economy, to encourage economic development in Aboriginal communities. And clearly we're going to have to dial that up further if in fact we end up adopting the UNDRIP principles here in BC.
Ben?
I think definitely we have to dial it up. I will say that I think we have some shining examples in British Columbia of progressive good change as far as First Nations are concerned. So if we look at the Haida, for example, on Haida Gwaii, after years of disputes over logging in the archipelago, we have them effectively working as true partners in co-managing forest resources on the archipelago. What I find disturbing is that we have a government that has to date largely picked and choose who it will highlight as exemplary and who it won't. So as an example, we had Premier Clark praising First Nations on the Mid-Coast and Central Coast for reaching an agreement around the Great Bear Rainforest, and in the next breath decrying the forces of no that were opposed to LNG. You can't pick and choose. To be just and fair to First Nations in this province requires that we listen to them. I'm working on a project right now looking at water usage in northeast British Columbia, and very, very clearly we have to do much, much more to improve how First Nations are consulted and worked with when it comes to energy developments in that sector of the province. So we have a lot of work to do. I don't think it's enough to simply refer one project proposal after another to them and ask them to respond on a very short time frame and expect that that is going to be acceptable for long. And we're starting to see in British Columbia significant resistance to that model. There's a potentially precedent-setting lawsuit underway by the Blueberry River First Nation in which they are suing the province over cumulative impacts on their lands. So I don't think that that's a road that we want to go down at all, and I think it's important for us to really step up.
Before we go to a break, one thing I would note, I think a positive development in the outgoing cabinet that was sworn in this week was the appointment of a First Nations leader, Ellis Ross, as a cabinet minister, and there's every likelihood, as you run down the list of likely cabinet ministers in an incoming NDP government, of a First Nations person at the cabinet table there as well. We may start hearing voices at the cabinet table that haven't been heard before, and I think in the long run that might help some. There are a lot of challenges ahead on this issue. We'll take a brief break. Voice of BC, stay with us. One more segment to go.
The Liberals' dominance of the interior of and north of the province really is a big challenge for the NDP and Greens. They need to come up with a vision of how people in those communities can be assisted in these really tough economic times, and also deal with some of the issues that they're dealing with. For example, the interior of BC is aging even more rapidly than urban areas.
In all Shaw systems across BC, you can catch the encore presentation of this show on Sunday at 2 p.m.
This is Isaac. He spends a lot of time in bed. He's always wanted a gaming system. His doctor told his mom and dad to reach out to Children's Wish. So they did. And then, one day, Children's Wish made his wish come true. Now, he's more connected online with friends and family.
I hate to be the I told you so guy, but for years on this show, I've been talking about affordability, taxation, and the rising cost of living, especially in the Lower Mainland. Hopefully now the BC Liberals will start to address taxation, housing, and a lot of these other issues that cost some votes in Greater Vancouver.
Welcome back to Voice of BC, and we are generally talking about the urban-rural divide in British Columbia, though we're talking about our economy and some resource issues as well. Here's an interesting question from the mayor of Hudson's Hope about how the nature of big resource projects has changed as she sees them around her. Here she is, Gwen Johansson.
One issue that faces resource communities, and often they're small communities, is the issue of what the resource extraction contributes to the community. It used to be that if there was a large development of some sort, whether it was forestry or mining or whatever, then those people came, they brought their families, they settled into the community and became part of it. They joined the Lions Club, they sent their kids to the school. And now that's changed. With the advent of camps and the wonderful transportation system that we have, we find that a lot of those families, they live somewhere else. The worker comes in, he spends maybe 2 weeks in a camp, and then he leaves. So the issue of camps is huge for resource communities. And does the panel have some suggestion for what could be done to deal with the fly-in, fly-out camp phenomenon?
John?
I could see this not an ideal business model from the perspective of people living and running small communities, but the problem is there just isn't an available local labor supply for a lot of these projects. We see it right across Canada. It's not unique to BC. And that's given rise to the sort of fly-in, fly-out phenomenon. The whole oil sands operates, or much of it operates on that basis. You see the mining operations in the territories to the north are all run that way. So I find it hard to imagine that there's another sort of model that would work, but maybe more creative minds than my own can take a look at it.
I would think
it's quite well
like
established.
A pulp mill or a smelter, like
that's different.
The new smelter in Kitimat that Alcan has just built, or Rio Tinto.
That's not fly out.
Yeah.
And pulp mills and most sawmills are not either. It tends to be more in the energy and to some extent the mining space.
And it's true of Site C.
Yeah,
but that's a
construction
project.
It's a construction project. It comes to an end.
Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. In Northeast BC, there's all kinds of sign of camps that have been established, typically in the energy sector. Oil and gas, and more recently hydroelectricity. I think one of the things that is happening in the Northeast, which is kind of troubling and which would help to kind of counterbalance that some, is that in a community like Fort Nelson, for example, you've got a community that has been devastated by a downturn in the energy sector. But more importantly, if you go back, a significant decline in the forest sector. And I really think that there are opportunities in some of these communities to rethink how we work with the forest sector in particular. I mean, you've got a company in Canfor that is essentially involved in speculation right now. It is sitting on a license. It is employing no people. It is doing no logging. There are opportunities, I think, with changes in government policy that would encourage new investment in that area that would not be worker camp jobs. It would be stable mill jobs.
We've been told when the legislature sits in British Columbia next week on the 22nd of June to prepare for a flood of national media attention. In fact, Press Gallery had to have a meeting last week to discuss handing out passes and letting everybody know what the rules are for getting in and out of the building, because there's security there now. Because suddenly we've had a British Columbia election that's made us a subject of national interest. And one of the reasons we're of interest, not just because this weird result where everything's almost a tie and all that stuff, which is of interest to us, but because there's a national issue associated with this election that straddles two provinces and involves the federal government as well. Here with a question about it, Bill Tillman.
The proposed Kinder Morgan pipeline will be one of the biggest construction projects in Canada, and it will go through British Columbia, if it proceeds at all. Do you think that the opposition to the Kinder Morgan pipeline, from environmentalists to First Nations to the new NDP government backed by the Greens, will be successful, or will Rachel Notley and Justin Trudeau push it through regardless?
Two NDP governments side by side, disagreeing profoundly on this, and as closely connected as probably two NDP governments have ever been in this country. Give me your take on it. This is a fascinating story.
It's going to be fascinating to see what happens. I mean, very, very clearly there is a strong opposition to the project that the NDP and Greens have both acknowledged. To me, one of the fascinating things about the opposition to this project is that really, if you want to talk about the environmental impacts that are associated with this project, they're actually the greatest environmental costs that are being borne regarding this project really are in Northeast British Columbia and tie in with the production of gas, in particular wet gas, which then moves to Alberta to help fuel the tar sands industry, which then ultimately may be connected by an expanded pipeline system. So at the end of the day, as is often the case, it is the more remote regions of the province that are paying the price. But here, the opposition to the project is largely centered on the pipeline itself and on increased tanker traffic. And to me, that's one of the things I find a little bit troubling about energy projects in particular, is that they have a vast reach. And for most of us living in the Lower Mainland or in the capital region who may not want tankers in our waters, we don't have any understanding of the true economic and environmental things that are coming into play in the north that ultimately produce all of that oil and all of that gas.
The national government has already said this thing should go ahead. The national government has jurisdiction over interprovincial projects like pipelines. They control the ports. They control the waters.
They've approved the project. They've put their shoulder to the wheel politically behind the project. The national business community is behind the project. If this is a priority for Prime Minister Trudeau and his cabinet, which I think is much more important than what the Premier of Alberta thinks, and they're prepared to use the tools that they have available at their disposal, I think the project can and will go ahead, but I'm not underestimating the degree of friction and conflict it's going to precipitate. That's obviously going to be significant.
Well, one asks, like the first question you ask is, you can see the legal and constitutional stuff, but do we get the kind of protests that we've had in the past in this province around these kind of projects? And how many members of the provincial government caucus will be chaining themselves to the fences? It's not out of the question.
No.
We've had political activists in the past who also sat in legislatures in Parliament.
I would hope they'll be a little more careful than that, but there's going to be protests for sure. The scale of it I can't predict, nor the eventual political response. But it's I had somebody in my office recently from a big sovereign wealth fund from offshore, and this person said, this project has gone through all these reviews. Your national government supports it. Energy is your largest export industry. You'll end up moving it by rail, probably, if you didn't actually have the pipelines. He just was completely flummoxed as to why this had become such a hot-button political issue in BC. The other thing I'd say on this is this has to be looked at through the national interest. This is not about what the Mayor Burnaby likes, in my opinion, in his community. It's what does the country need to succeed and provide access to the markets that we must serve for our largest export industry. And you can say, well, we shouldn't do it because it's inconsistent with our Paris climate change commitments or whatever. That's an argument that people will make. But at the end of the day, this has really got to be framed through the lens, in my opinion, of what's good for the country as a whole, rather than just the impacts on BC or even Alberta, for that matter.
Well, how it plays out will be fascinating, and I think that's one reason why the results of the BC election and how they play out in the months ahead will be watched right across the country, because it's been a long time, I think, since British Columbia has been at the fulcrum of what could be a national constitutional crisis. So we aren't there yet. It could be a national political problem. It may be just something that they end up handling with by hauling people off barricades, but we're certainly headed for a lot of attention on this one. Good to talk about it. Here's an interesting question from Dermot Travis of Integrity BC, who in his usual mischievous way challenges the whole premise of this TV show, our subject tonight. Here's Dermot.
A lot's being made of the idea that there's a rural-urban split in British Columbia. But truth be told, most provinces have a rural-urban split. Canada has a rural-urban split. Are we making too much of something here that, quite frankly, is just part of our political fabric?
Maybe they deal with it better elsewhere, or maybe it's something new to us. What do you think?
Well, I think I agree with them 100%. This is a pan-Canadian phenomenon for sure. We're becoming a much more urban country, by the way, just in terms of where people are living. I think what's a little different is just the way the election sorted out this last time, where you had, as you pointed out a few minutes ago, you had a number of ridings which 10 or 15 years ago were strong NDP, kind of resource-based communities that really shut the NDP out of most of those areas. So the electoral map looks kind of stark when you examine the colors, for the different parties right now. And that is something maybe a little bit different. But the underlying tension and the sort of political management challenge that he's referring to it's not new to BC, and it's certainly not unique to BC.
Clearly it isn't. I mean, I recall being in Ontario, Western Ontario, years ago, and hearing mill workers in some of the pulp industry towns there decrying Eastern interests, and they were talking about Eastern interests in their own province. So there very clearly is significant rural-urban divides in provinces across the country. But for me, I keep coming back to the fact that no matter how many people move and live in major urban centers, we still rely on the goods and services that are produced elsewhere in our provinces. And I think it is really incumbent upon us to think more about that. And again, as I said at the outset, we are seeing significant lagging behind, if you will, in pretty much every area outside of the Lower Mainland and Greater Victoria area. And I think we really need to look at policies being put in place that are going to strengthen economic prospects in those regions, as well as further environmental protection.
We'll go to the mayor of one of many small communities in British Columbia that might have the same question, but we're going to him, Mike Rattan. Here he is.
We're a small community. We're in the middle of transition. We're moving from what we've always been to what we're going to become. We have lots of challenges as a community. What would you suggest we be thinking about as we move into the next 20 years? What do you think Port Alberni should be considering for the next 20 years' time?
Ben.
Well, it's, earlier on we were talking about raw log exports. If you're going to look at a community like Port Alberni, which had a thriving and forest industry, very diverse forest industry employment, what you're seeing more and more is a community that's being reduced to being an exporter of raw logs. I don't think that that's a recipe for success in a community that has a great port and has the infrastructure in place to be creating forest jobs. And I think that they need to be focusing on that and where the opportunities are to begin to add value rather than subtract value. I also think you need to recognize that in communities like Port Alberni, things are changing. These are becoming communities where people are moving into because of more affordable housing, possibly wanting to retire in these communities. And for many of those people, what is important are the ecological amenities of the area. And so, I think it's very important that the community safeguard its water supply, have a healthy environment in which people can live and recreate in, and those are things that begin to give shape to the future of that community. And I also think that they need to pick up and exploit as much as possible on the fact that they are a port, that they have the ability to ship, and that they could be shipping more products than some of the unprocessed products that they're currently shipping.
Jock, I hear often this, and we've talked about it on this show many times with different political parties and different governments, about value added and moving beyond raw log exports and raw exports of any kind. What are the obstacles to getting that to happen in Canada and in British Columbia?
Well, ultimately, policy has some role in it, but ultimately it's a question of the economics. If it was a good business proposition to invest in new production and processing facilities in any industry, in our province, then I think the capitalists would come forward to do so. So there's obviously economic barriers and constraints that a lot of the simple commentary on these issues, tends to overlook. I do have to mention, my parents were married in Port Alberni shortly after World War II, and we have a clipping in our family collection of things from the past, of a Globe and Mail newspaper story reporting in 1947, I think, that Port Alberni was one of the top 5 ranked communities in Canada for average household income, because that was during a certain period when the forest industry was booming. But it's a resilient community, and living in the Lower Mainland, I see an area that's getting more crowded, more congested, more unaffordable, housing, land costs absolutely through the roof. I think we may actually be on the cusp of an exodus of people out of the Lower Mainland. Not a vast exodus, but a modest, sort of net outflow, going to communities on Vancouver Island. We're already seeing some of this, the Fraser Valley up in the Okanagan, because the economic model we've got in the Lower Mainland, I think, is really tenuous. It's the cost of housing and land is so disconnected from the income earning capacity of households, and I think it's going to get worse rather than better. That could be very bad for Metro Vancouver, but could actually have some positive spin-off impacts in other parts of the province, including the central part of Vancouver Island.
You can buy a house in these places and still have money left over
to feed your family.
Yeah.
Lon, if I could quickly add to Jock's last point, we're actually seeing spillover quite some distance from Vancouver in this regard. So more people moving in and investing in housing in 100 Mile House, Williams Lake, and Quesnel. So there's definitely a significant ripple effect that is occurring. But as these people move in, we have to remember that there has to be a vibrant and healthy economy there to make it all work.
But having the move-in will help it.
Hear that, folks, on the other side of the rural divide? We urbanites are coming for you. So make some room. Sell us a house. Thanks very much, Ben, for being on the show. Really appreciate it. I know you put it together in short notice. But Jock, thanks for coming over.
Thank you.
Good. Thanks for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature, BC politics, and sooner or later, a new government into your living room. Good night.